Well, here I go again. After the controversial nature of my last video involving Andrew Jackson, I decided to take on a less controversial figure in Ulysses S. Grant. Despite Grant being literally the general who defeated General Lee and the Confederate Army, for some reason idiots have decided to tear down statues of him. In today's video, I'm going to discuss Grant and why he should be remembered as not only a good general, but a great president. Part 1. Why the statue came down. According to an article I read in The Independent, which stated that protesters took down a statue of General Grant because he owned a slave, which is ironic because these so-called social justice protesters unknowingly just fell for a lost cause talking point, and I'll explain why. Grant's father, Jesse Grant, was strongly against the institution of slavery, and certainly that belief went to his son. Grant went on to marry the sister of his West Point roommate, Julia Dent. Julia came from a slaveholding Missouri family, and she, not Grant, inherited 4 slaves from her father. Eventually, Grant would leave the military to attempt to become a farmer near Julia's family. Yet, he found farming not to be as lucrative as he hoped, and Grant was in immense financial trouble. Grant went as far as to write to his father for loans, who refused to give him any because Grant was living among slave owners. After the death of his mother-in-law, Grant moved to Julia's family farm and was tasked with overseeing it. According to historian Hamlin Garland, Grant found, and I quote, "the use of slaves on the farm a source of irritation and shame." Eventually, Grant came into the possession of a man named William Jones. Though Grant owned William for a year, he gave William his freedom papers without payment or without a deal being worked out between them. It should also be noted that Grant was still in severe financial trouble, and a slave such as William could have got Grant life-changing money. But Grant's morals prevailed, and William was set free. Now, this Grant was a slaveholder myth has been used by the Lost Cause and the alt-right as a talking point for why the Confederacy was a noble cause. They often say something like, General Lee didn't own slaves, but Grant did, and bring up some dumb Lost Cause meme. The fact is, Grant was against the institution of slavery, which is why he fought against the South despite his wife's family being from a slave state. His actions regarding William Jones should be commended, not looked down upon. Now, another criticism the Independence article gives is how Grant was also responsible for, and I quote, "the cultural genocide of Native Americans," which is completely untrue. The policy the Independence article is referring to is Grant's Indian peace policy, which called for Indians to be handled peacefully and not through warfare. According to the policy, Grant wanted to eliminate corrupt agents in the Bureau of Indian Affairs who were profiting from their positions by exploiting the natives. Moreover, the plan also called for training natives how to raise crops so they wouldn't be as reliant on nomadic food such as the buffalo. And lastly, the plan wanted to establish English-speaking schools on reservations to help the natives adapt more to American life. I don't know about you, but these sound like very reasonable policies and are much better than the alternative of literally wiping them out through wars and coercion. Frankly, compared to the centuries of struggle and brutality felt by white settlers, the Indian peace policies seem like a very humane and good deal to the natives. So, no complaints from me there. Part 2. The Scandals. Though not in the Independence article, a major criticism I've heard about Grant is how his administration was ripe with scandals. Honestly, this might be a much better reason to criticize Grant than him freeing a slave and his fake massacre of the Indians, but I digress. Anyway, one of the famous scandals under the Grant administration was the credit Mobile scandal, where stockholders decided to cheat their own company of millions of dollars. Some of the stockholders included United States senators and Grant's very own vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Another scandal came in 1873 when J. Cook and Company, who was one of the biggest financiers of the Transcontinental Railroad, declared bankruptcy. Due to how large Jay Cooke and Company was, this created a domino effect which led to other railroads to declare bankruptcy. The nation soon got swept into another panic, now known as the Panic of 1873, where millions of Americans lost their jobs. Despite the panic, the Grant administration felt another scandal with the whiskey ring, where cabinet officials, including Grant's secretary Orville Babcock, filled false reports to falsely acquire $3 million worth of taxpayer dollars. This was in a recession, keep in mind. Now, none of these sound good, but it should be noted that Grant was never implicated in any of them. And frankly, I don't think he knew that this was going on. You have to remember, Grant had virtually no political experience before becoming president. So handling a cabinet was extremely foreign to him. It should not be a surprise when an inexperienced politician is taken advantage of by experienced politicians. And Grant's administration basically used him to personally enrich themselves. What is ironic is despite the fraud allegations, Grant's administration made huge strides in eliminating nepotism in government. Prior to Grant's regime, elected officials could give out jobs despite someone's qualifications. Grant changed this by pushing civil service legislation and by creating the first Civil Service Commission. The aim of these programs were to create entry tests to enter into government jobs, which would eliminate much of the corruption behind them. Today, the Foreign Service Officers Test only has a 40% pass rate, and this can be attributed to Grant's administration. Unfortunately, Grant's experiment would make him a lot of political enemies, who resented Grant for minimizing their power. But you see how Grant was starting to become a successful president. The first thing I want to talk about when discussing the Grant administration is how the 15th Amendment was ratified during his administration. The 15th Amendment prohibited the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Essentially, this amendment ensured that freed slaves would have the right to vote. Moreover, unlike many weak Reconstruction leaders such as Andrew Johnson, who actually sucks, Grant wanted federal enforcement of civil rights in southern states. Prior to this, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan would intimidate southern blacks into not voting, and in some cases, not running for office at all. To combat this, in 1870 and 1871, Grant passed the Enforcement Acts, which created codes which would protect African Americans' right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and to receive equal protection under the law. Moreover, the acts also established penalties for intruding on someone's right to vote, and if needed, the Army or National Guard were allowed to enforce the act if states still prevented African Americans from voting. Moreover, the Enforcement Act of 1871 also permitted federal oversight of local and state elections from any election where over 20,000 people lived in the town. Though this still meant many local small towns did not have government oversight, in medium towns and certainly metropolitan areas, freed slaves were ensured voting rights. Simultaneously, Grant was actively working to end the first iteration of the KKK. Prior to the Grant administration, the Klan thrived in undermining Reconstruction efforts and ensuring freed blacks did not exercise their constitutional right to vote. With the Enforcement Acts, trials were finally conducted regarding Klan members. Over 3,000 Klan members were indicted, and 600 were convicted for crimes against freed slaves in the South. Famously, even KKK founder and leader Nathan Bedford Forrest was called to testify. Though he was not convicted, this shows the power of Grant's administration in enforcing social justice in the Reconstruction South. Grant did so much damage to the KKK that the Klan did not resurface until the 1920s. The Grant administration's accomplishments did not end with Reconstruction. Grant also showed immense skills in international diplomacy. The Virginius affair was when the Spanish captured an American ship and executed 53 of the ship's crew, which included 8 Americans. After the affair, many Americans called for a war with Spain, yet Grant knew diplomacy would be the best action for the United States. Instead of starting a costly war, the Grant administration got the Spanish government to pay $80,000 to the families of the 8 Americans who died, and the Spanish were publicly to express sorrow for the affair. Another example of Grant's foreign policy accomplishments was the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875, which gave the United States free access to sugar and other tropical fruit grown in Hawaii. This treaty led to mass investment by the United States sugar farmers and eventually led to Hawaii being incorporated into the United States economically, which led them to become the 50th state later in their history. And before you comment on it, I have no issues with the United States and how they handled Hawaii. They are definitely better off as a member of the United States than being an independent country. And most of the shady stuff with Hawaii did not occur until after Grant's presidency, so he's free from that. Part 3. The Butcher Grant. We are now going to go away from what Grant did as a politician, and I'm going to transition to what he did as a general. Before I dive into this though, I'm a political historian, not a military historian, so when it comes to battle tactics, I'm usually going to lean on historical opinions and not my own, but either way, I do believe that we need to talk about Grant's military career. So a common argument I have heard about Grant is he was not a good general, and that he haphazardly threw his troops at the Confederate lines without regard for his men's lives. In fact, many lost causers have given Grant the nickname the Butcher Grant, and will even go as far as to say that he only won because of the North's military might, which is just simply not true. When it comes to the Butcher argument, it should be noted that Grant was on the offensive, which statistically loses more men than armies in defensive positions. When Grant took over in the East, the battle strategies have completely changed from Napoleonic open field strategies to what we saw of the beginning of the war to an early version of trench warfare. We all know how insane the casualties were in World War I, so just imagine taking Northern Virginia when your army uses trench warfare strategies. It should not be a surprise that Grant lost so many men, but this does not mean that he was not a great commander. Okay, I guess I should start at the beginning of Grant's time in the Civil War. As mentioned earlier, Grant was an ineffective farmer, so he volunteered for the U.S. Army in 1861. Initially, Grant was tasked with recruiting and training volunteers, but he was promoted to colonel and eventually brigadier general in charge of southeast Missouri. In the Western theater, Grant thrived. In 1862, Grant captured notable forts such as Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. During the Battle of the Shiloh, the Confederates conducted a surprise attack against Grant's army, which they swiftly repelled, and the Confederates had to retreat. In many ways, these were the first notable victories for the Union Army, and it gave Grant the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Though these victories were very impressive, nothing compares to Grant's victory in the Siege of Vicksburg. Due to the nature of the Anaconda Plan, controlling the Mississippi River was vital to ultimate victory during the Civil War. After winning a calculated series of battles, Grant's army eventually besieged Vicksburg, which was the last Confederate stronghold in the Mississippi River. After 46 days, Confederate General John Pemberton surrendered his force of 30,000 men. The Union had split the Confederacy in two, and in many ways, this was considered the turning point of the Civil War, especially with Gettysburg so close. Later in 1863, Grant was given control of all Western armies. His first task was to relieve the Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga. Grant personally went to Chattanooga and won the Battle of Missionary Ridge. Grant's victory gave the Union control of Tennessee and opened up Georgia for a possible Union invasion. Though these are brilliant battles, most people criticize Grant's casualties during the Overland Campaign. Though I will acknowledge the Overland Campaign's casualty numbers were disgusting. As mentioned previously, Grant was on the offensive. Moreover, this criticism that he utilized the industrial might of the North should not even be an insult, but a compliment. Considering unlike other generals, such as McClellan, Grant used all of his resources to his advantage. Come on, guys. The Overland Campaign literally led to the siege of Richmond and Petersburg, and Lee eventually surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant was a great general, and anyone saying otherwise is just plain wrong. But History Channel guy, what about Grant's alcoholism? Okay, now you're just getting into Grant's personal addictions, but screw it, I'll bite. Yes, Grant abused alcohol, but this never prevented him from being prepared for battle. Frankly, the only time Grant would get wasted was when he had long idle periods of doing nothing. But when he had to get the job done, Grant did it and did it well. So was Grant an alcoholic? Well, maybe, but honestly, we don't know if he was an occasional binge drinker or a true alcoholic. But even if he was an alcoholic, if that's what you're using to diminish the man, then you're truly grasping for straws. Part 4. Healing the Fractured Nation. So in conclusion, I think President Grant has been very mistreated by the majority of the public. The common conception of Grant was he was a unruly drunk who had an incredibly corrupt administration. But myself and modern historians have taken a deeper look into Grant's administration and have concluded that he was probably a pretty good president. Keep in mind, the United States in the 1870s was a very fragile country. The trauma of the Civil War was still ripe in everyone's mind, and a strong figure was needed to deal with the racism of the South. Grant worked to help the fractured nation while simultaneously helping former slaves gain their constitutional rights. So, we need to keep in mind preserving the Union was on top of Grant's list, which was definitely not a foregone conclusion. For as awful as he was, Andrew Johnson was a Southern Democrat who was sympathetic to the rebelling states. Grant was certainly not sympathetic to the Southern states, which made many Southern politicians hesitant about his intentions. Grant was sure to make symbolic gestures to the South, including inviting his former adversary, General Robert E. Lee, to the White House. Lee and Grant discuss how to readmit all the Southern states into the Union, and by 1870, every Southern state met the required concessions and was readmitted into the Union. In 1872, Grant passed the Amnesty Act, which restored the voting rights and the right to run for office for almost all Confederate soldiers. The Amnesty Act did not include any rebel who were, and I quote, senators and representatives of the 36th and 37th Congress, officers in the judicial, military, and naval service of the United States, heads of departments, and foreign ministers of the United States. So basically anyone who held a federal position. I've already mentioned how Grant did remarkable things for the African American community during his time as president, but Frederick Douglass said it best when Grant died. He said, "To him, more than any other man, the Negro owes his enfranchisement." In all, try not to unfairly judge General Grant, because he was a great man. And if you see some idiot trying to tear down his statue, show them this video, so hopefully they can learn. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you want more in defense of videos. I honestly love making these in defense of videos, so just keep feeding me options. I think next week I'm going to do in defense of Nixon, but I can do a spicier topic if you'd like me to. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.